Moving along to superintendent recommendations and reports.
Yes, at this time, I'd like to ask Mrs. Hauer to cover the items listed under Personnel Professional and Personnel Support.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Begley and members of the board, I have several items for your consideration this evening under Personnel Professional. Number 1, resignations, letters A and B, and number 2, employment, letters A through D. And that concludes all the items I have for your consideration under Personnel Professional.
Thank you, Mrs. Hauer. I'll entertain a motion to accept these recommendations.
So moved.
Second.
Mrs. Birding Miller and Mrs. Gundrum. Mrs. Lane, call the roll.
Mrs. Birding Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Gundrum.
Yes.
Mrs. Shorter.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mr. Begley.
Yes.
Mr. Begley and members of the board, I also have several items for your consideration this evening under Personnel Support. Number 1, resignations, letters A through K, and number 2, employment, letters A through E. And that concludes the items I have for your consideration under Personnel Support.
Again, thank you, Mrs. Hauer. I'll entertain a motion to accept these recommendations.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Clark and Mrs. Shorter. Mrs. Lane, call the roll.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Shorter.
Yes.
Mrs. Gundrum.
Yes.
Mrs. Birding Miller.
Yes.
Mr. Begley.
Yes. Thank you.